My beloved, do not scroll away from this moment, because something has been waiting at the edge of your awareness, something quiet, something deeply connected to the person whose heart has been carrying your name more often than you realize. Pause here for a moment. What you are about to hear is not meant to frighten you, and it is not meant to make you chase answers that are not yours to force. It is meant to open a door inside your heart, because something shifted recently, and the person you have been thinking about felt that shift more strongly than they expected. There was a phone call. There were only a few words at first. Then suddenly, the room around them seemed to disappear. Their expression changed. Their voice became quieter. And when your name entered the conversation, something inside them stopped pretending it was unaffected. You need to understand this carefully, because the silence that followed that call was not empty. It was full. Full of memories they had been avoiding. Full of questions they had never dared to ask you directly. Full of feelings they thought they had successfully hidden beneath distractions, responsibilities, pride, and the ordinary noise of life. They had been telling themselves that time would make everything simpler. They believed distance would weaken what they felt. They thought if they stayed busy enough, laughed loudly enough, answered everyone else, and kept moving forward, eventually your presence in their heart would become quieter. But that phone call did the opposite. It brought everything back at once. The person on the other end did not begin with drama. That is what made it more powerful. The conversation started normally, almost casually. Your soulmate was distracted, doing something else, only half listening. They expected nothing important. But then the tone changed. The caller hesitated before saying something about you, and your soulmate immediately became still. They may not have admitted it, but their attention sharpened at the sound of anything connected to you. There are some names the heart recognizes before the mind has time to protect itself. Yours has become one of those names for them. They asked, almost too quickly, what about them? Then they tried to sound calm, as though the answer did not matter very much. But heaven saw what happened in that second. Their breathing changed. Their hands stopped moving. Their thoughts raced ahead of the conversation. They wondered if something had happened to you. They wondered if you had moved on. They wondered whether you had finally closed the door they kept assuming would somehow remain open. And beneath every question was one truth they had refused to say aloud: they were afraid of hearing that they had waited too long. But the caller did not tell them what they feared. Instead, they told them something they were not prepared to hear. Something about the way you had been carrying yourself. Something about the strength you had shown when no one was applauding you. Something about the way you had changed, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally began protecting your peace. And that was the first moment your soulmate went quiet, because they suddenly realized the version of you they had kept frozen in their mind was no longer the whole story. They remembered you as someone who would always understand, always forgive, always leave a little light on for them even when they disappeared into their confusion. They remembered the softness in you, but perhaps they mistook softness for endless availability. They remembered how deeply you cared, but perhaps they assumed deep love would always wait without asking questions. Yet what they heard on that phone call forced them to see something different. You had not become cold. You had become clearer. You had not stopped feeling. You had simply learned that love should not require you to abandon yourself. And this is where the conversation became even more unexpected. The caller told them that someone had recently spoken highly of you. Not because you had asked them to. Not because you were trying to send a message. In fact, you may not even know this conversation happened. But your character had been noticed. The way you handled something difficult had been noticed. The way you refused to become bitter had been noticed. And when your soulmate heard this, their first reaction was not jealousy. It was something deeper. It was regret mixed with admiration. They started remembering moments they had misunderstood. A time when you became quiet and they assumed you did not care. A moment when you stepped back and they called it distance. A day when you stopped explaining yourself and they decided you were changing. Now, through someone else's words, they began to understand that your silence had never meant emptiness. Sometimes you were silent because you were tired of proving what your heart had already shown. Sometimes you stepped away because you needed to recover your dignity. Sometimes you stopped explaining because you realized the people who truly wanted to understand you would not require endless evidence. That realization landed heavily. Your soulmate looked away from everyone around them. They may have moved into another room. They may have lowered their voice. Something about the conversation suddenly felt too personal to have in front of other people. The caller continued, unaware of how strongly every word was reaching them. But inside your soulmate, a hidden door had opened, and behind it were emotions they had been storing for much longer than they wanted to admit. They remembered something you once said. Perhaps it was a small sentence, something that seemed ordinary at the time. Maybe you told them that you did not need perfection, only honesty. Maybe you said you could handle the truth better than confusion. Maybe you simply asked them to tell you where you stood. Whatever the exact words were, they returned to your soulmate during that phone call with extraordinary clarity. They finally understood what you had been asking for. Not a miracle. Not a grand performance. Not endless promises. Just truth. And they realized how many times fear had made them choose silence instead. My child, there are moments when people do not lose love because the feeling disappears. Sometimes they nearly lose love because they are afraid to become visible inside it. Your soulmate has been wrestling with exactly that. They wanted the safety of knowing you cared without having to risk revealing how much they cared. They wanted connection without vulnerability. They wanted time without consequence. But love does not stay frozen while people decide whether they are brave enough to honor it. The phone call became a mirror. And what they saw in that mirror surprised them. They saw someone who had been waiting for certainty while giving you uncertainty. They saw someone who wanted reassurance while rarely offering enough of it. They saw someone who had convinced themselves they were protecting their heart when, in truth, they were protecting their pride. That realization did not make them angry with you. It made them quieter. For a few seconds, the caller actually asked if they were still there. Your soulmate answered, yes. But their mind was somewhere else. It was with you. They pictured your face. They wondered what you were doing at that exact moment. They wondered whether you ever still thought about them in the quiet hours. They wondered if you had finally reached the point where remembering them no longer hurt. And then another thought came, sharper than all the others. What if someone else has started seeing what I was too afraid to value properly? That thought unsettled them. Not because love is about ownership. Heaven is not showing you possession. Love cannot be commanded. But your soulmate suddenly understood that your life had continued while they were standing inside hesitation. You were growing. You were healing. You were becoming more certain of what kind of energy you would allow near your heart. And the person on the phone, without trying to create urgency, had made them realize that other people could see your worth too. Then came the second revelation. The caller mentioned that you had apparently been offered some kind of new beginning. It may have been emotional, professional, social, or simply a fresh season in your life, but the exact details mattered less than what it symbolized. You were no longer standing in the same place where your soulmate had left you emotionally. Something was opening for you. And strangely, your soulmate felt proud. That surprised them. They thought they would feel threatened. Instead, beneath the fear, there was tenderness. They wanted good things for you. They wanted you to succeed. They wanted you to smile again. Yet the possibility that your happiness might unfold without them forced a painful question into their mind. Why did I wait so long to speak? This is where heaven began working quietly in the spaces between words. Your soulmate did not suddenly become a different person. Real change rarely happens in one dramatic second. But something cracked open. A defense they had carried for a long time became weaker. An excuse that once seemed convincing no longer sounded true. They had told themselves that the timing wasn't right. They had told themselves they needed to be completely certain before taking a step. They had told themselves they should wait for some perfect sign. But now they were beginning to see that sometimes certainty is born after courage, not before it. The caller kept talking, but your soulmate had already entered another conversation internally, one between fear and truth. Fear said, "Do nothing. Stay quiet. Protect yourself." Truth said, "If you remain silent forever, silence will choose the ending for you." Fear said, "Maybe they no longer care." Truth replied, "You never gave them the clarity they deserved." Fear said, "What if they reject you?" Truth whispered, "What if you lose them without ever being honest?" That final question stayed. Even after the phone call ended. Your soulmate looked at the screen for several seconds. They did not immediately return to what they had been doing. They were physically in the same place, but emotionally, they had gone far away. The people around them may have noticed their mood change. Someone may even have asked what happened, and your soulmate probably dismissed it with a small answer. "Nothing. Just something I heard. I'm fine." But they were not feeling nothing. They were feeling everything they had postponed. And somewhere inside that silence, your name became a prayer. Not necessarily a prayer spoken in formal words. Sometimes prayer is simply the heart reaching toward someone it cannot forget. Sometimes prayer is a person staring at a phone and hoping the universe gives them courage. Sometimes prayer is a memory returning so vividly that you realize you were never as detached as you pretended. Your soulmate began replaying the last meaningful interaction between you. They remember details you may assume they forgot. The tone of your voice. A pause between sentences. Something in your eyes. The moment you seem to be holding back words because you did not want to make the situation heavier. They remember more than they have ever admitted. They began wondering whether you knew how nervous they were. Whether you saw through the calm expression. Whether you realized their silence was not lack of feeling but too much feeling without enough courage. But my child, even deep feeling cannot replace action forever. That is one of the truths heaven is placing before this connection. Love deserves expression. Respect deserves consistency. Hope deserves honesty. And you deserve to live your life without having to decode someone else's silence endlessly. That does not mean this story is finished. In fact, the opposite may be true. Because after that phone call, something unusual happened. Your soulmate opened their messages. They searched for your name. They found your conversation. And they stayed there. At first, they did not type anything. They simply scrolled. Perhaps through recent messages. Perhaps through older ones they had not looked at in a long time. They saw words differently now. They noticed places where you had tried to reach them emotionally. They noticed where your tone had changed. They noticed the moment you began protecting yourself. And then they saw one message that stopped them completely. A message from you they had previously read too quickly. At the time, they may have thought they understood it. Now they realized they had missed what was underneath it. There was tenderness there. There was disappointment too. But more than anything, there was a quiet invitation. You had given them an opening. And they had been too afraid to walk through it. For the first time, they wondered if that opening might still exist. Their fingers hovered over the keyboard. They typed something. Then deleted it. They typed again. Deleted that too. Not because they had nothing to say, but because every sentence suddenly felt too small. How are you? Felt dishonest when what they truly wanted to ask was, did I hurt you more than I understood? I was thinking about you. Felt incomplete when the truth was, I have tried not to think about you, and I failed. I heard something today, sounded too casual when what they wanted to confess was, something I heard today made me realize how much I may have taken your heart for granted. So they put the phone down. But only for a moment. This is important. Because you may assume silence always means retreat. This time, it did not. This time, silence was preparation. Your soulmate began thinking about what honesty would actually require. Not a vague message. Not another half step. Not a conversation that leaves you more confused than before. They began imagining what it would mean to truly tell you what has been happening inside them. And suddenly they were afraid of their own truth. Because once certain words are spoken, there is no returning to pretending. They would have to admit that they missed you. They would have to admit that your absence affected them. They would have to admit they watched for signs from you. They would have to admit they sometimes wondered whether you were happier without them. And most difficult of all, they would have to admit that some of the distance between you existed because they were scared of how real this connection felt. There is another layer you have not seen yet. The phone call did not only contain praise about you. Near the end, the caller said something else. Something your soulmate did not expect. The caller mentioned a conversation involving you and another person. Nothing improper. Nothing designed to wound them. But what was said in that conversation made your soulmate realize there was a side of your heart they had never fully understood. Apparently, when someone asked about love, commitment, or what you truly wanted from another person, your answer was different from what your soulmate expected. You did not ask for perfection. You did not ask for wealth. You did not ask for someone who would never make mistakes. You wanted presence, truth, mutual effort. A person who would choose you clearly rather than keeping you trapped inside uncertainty. When your soulmate heard this, something inside them sank. Because they realized you had never been asking for something impossible. You had been asking for something they could have offered if they had stopped letting fear lead them. The revelation humbled them. For a long time, they assumed the situation between you was complicated. Now they were beginning to wonder whether fear had made something simple feel impossible. Care. Speak. Show up. Tell the truth. These were not impossible things. They were simply vulnerable ones. That distinction changed everything. Hours later, your soulmate was still thinking about the phone call. They replayed parts of it in their mind. One sentence in particular refused to leave them. The caller had said something like, "You may not realize how much this person has changed." Changed. That word stayed. Your soulmate wondered what your healing had made you willing to release. They wondered whether you had outgrown waiting. They wondered whether the version of you who once would have reopened the door immediately might now stand behind it and ask, "Why should I trust this time will be different?" And instead of resenting that possibility, they understood it. Maybe for the first time. Because if they approached you now, they knew emotion alone would not be enough. They would need sincerity. They would need patience. They would need to respect whatever boundaries you had built. They would need to understand that your heart is not a place they can enter and exit whenever fear becomes inconvenient. This understanding marks a turning point. Not because it guarantees an outcome. Heaven does not remove free will. But awareness changes people. And once your soulmate saw the situation differently, they could no longer comfortably return to the old story. Something had been awakened. Later, when they were alone, they picked up their phone again. Your name was still there. This time they did not scroll through old messages. They opened a blank message. They began writing. Slowly. Not a greeting. Not small talk. A confession. The first sentence took them several minutes. They erased it 3 times. Then finally they left the words on the screen. Their heart was beating faster now because what they had written was more honest than anything they had allowed themselves to say before. But they still had not sent it. Then something happened. A new notification appeared. For 1 second, they thought it might be you. Their entire body reacted before they even looked. It was not you. But that moment revealed something to them. They wanted it to be. They wanted to hear from you more than they had admitted. They wanted some sign that the connection was not entirely lost. Yet as they stared at the unsent message, another realization rose inside them. Maybe they could not keep waiting for you to create the opening. Maybe this time, they had to become the opening. They looked at what they had written. Then they added another sentence. And another. The message grew. It became less polished and more truthful. They admitted something about the past. They explained something you had misunderstood. They confessed that there had been moments when they almost contacted you but stopped themselves. They even wrote about the phone call. And then they reached the part that frightened them most. The part where they had to tell you exactly what they heard about you. Because the caller had revealed one final detail they had not shared at the beginning of the conversation. A detail connected to something you once said, something your soulmate thought no one else knew. When they heard it, they asked the caller to repeat themselves. They needed to be certain. And the caller did. Your soulmate went completely silent. Because suddenly they understood that what had been happening around this connection was not what they had assumed. There was one missing piece. One truth neither of you had fully seen. And after hearing it, your soulmate whispered a sentence so quietly that the caller almost missed it. They said, "If that's true, then I need to tell them everything." But before they could decide whether to press send, the caller sent them something else. A message. A screenshot. Proof of the one detail that had changed the entire meaning of the conversation. Your soulmate opened it. Their eyes froze on the screen. And what they saw connected directly back to you.